Hello there, and welcome to What's the Point? A question we should all be asking ourselves, and the podcast by brand architect Bill Ellis that will help you discover, clarify, and live your purpose.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to this episode of What's the Point with a very special guest. And let me introduce you to Ralf Specht. He is the author of a brilliant new book called Building Corporate Soul. And that book is based on a system he's developed called the Soul System, and I guarantee you we'll talk about that in depth today. It's interesting, it's exciting, and it's something that will help you both in business and, frankly, in your personal life. So he was for 2 decades with McCann Erickson, one of the largest advertising agencies in the world, certainly at the time. And a lot of different roles. He then founded a company called Spark 44, an innovative industry-first joint venture with Jaguar. And I'm going to put in the show notes a link to a YouTube compilation of some of the work that Spark 44 did with Jaguar, because it's fascinating. It is really, really powerful marketing, and I'm envious that I couldn't be a part of something that it's that good. So Spark 44 grew to 1,200 people in 18 countries. And part of what we'll talk about in just a second is when Ralf announced his departure from Spark 44, the response he got from many of those 1,200 employees worldwide really touched him and validated for him that his Soul System framework is something that works and it's essential. So I'll ask you to talk about that in just a second. But that's also led to his driving vision to make soulless companies a thing of the past. So everyone say hello to Ralf Specht. Ralf, thank you for your time.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for that great introduction. I'm very humbled, and it's a delight to be on the show. So looking forward for our conversation.
As do I, and you know, it's I've heard it's there's no really reason to be humble if you've done it. So it's just pointing out your track record, which is pretty impressive. So let me start with asking you to get to the heart of your current vision, and that is define for us, however you choose to, a corporate soul, or maybe starting with a soulless company. Talk to us about that whole premise, please.
Yes. So, I mean, the concept of corporate culture has been around for quite a while, and everybody knows about it. And I often get asked, so what's the difference between corporate culture and corporate soul? And my answer is very simple and straightforward. So every company has got a culture. You can't have a company without a culture. The question is, what culture do you have? But only few companies have got what I call corporate soul. And the difference between the two is in companies with soul, there's full integrity between the strategic pillars of the organization, the purpose that we want to talk about, but also what I call the shared understanding, the vision, mission, values, plus spirit. And that's really important to me, and I'll talk about it in a second. If these two layers are sound in strategic terms, so the theory has been done well, these companies focus on delivering through the behaviors of their company, of their actions, be it what their people do, how they treat their people, be it how they treat customers, how they treat all stakeholders across the board. So the full integrity of the thinking and the actions is what makes a company having corporate soul and not just a mere culture.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I agree with you 100% that every company has a culture, and in my world, along those lines, I also say every company has a brand, as does every individual, and the question is whether or not we take charge of that, and whether or not it's true to who we are and what we want it to be. And that's what you're talking about, is bringing those elements together so that it's not just a sign on the wall, and it's not just talk, it's actually comes to life.
Correct.
Is that fair?
Correct. And that's why, and I mentioned it in the previous answer, that when you look at the shared understanding, everybody probably very quickly goes to, yeah, you need a vision, you need a mission, you got to be clear about your values. And I'm adding, you need a spirit too. And what is spirit, right?
Yes.
So spirit to me is the intended corporate culture. Like leadership, executives create an environment for the culture. The culture emerges from that. But in order to get to a culture that you want as a leader, you have to think about it first, right? You can either be as powerful as a company like LinkedIn, who define their values so strong that they basically include the spirit the company is supposed to be living. But most of the companies don't. The values very often are rather superficial, if you like, and you see like words like we're innovative or things like that, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with being innovative, but that doesn't give you a value that's unique and that is specific to your company. But LinkedIn did that perfectly, right? I mean, there's 7 values: members first, relationships matter, be open, be honest and constructive, demand excellence, take intelligent risks, and act like an owner. And if you read these 7, you already have a sense of how life at LinkedIn feels, and it's wonderfully connected to their purpose, to their mission, to their vision. And so it's a very strong example of how you can build the foundation for your corporate culture to emerge, and then build the activities and behaviors alongside those, and let people jump in, let people help you. And I think that's one of my biggest learnings in life. If as a leader you think you know all the answers, you've lost in the first place, because many of the answers come from your people.
Again, I agree. We're going to have a lot of agreement on this episode, Ralph. I'm sure of that from the sounds of it. You know, the 7 traits from LinkedIn that you mentioned. One of the things that I feel it's important to point out is that they were all action. They were all verb driven. It wasn't just a word of confidence or whatever. And I especially like the last 2 because the second to last one makes a ton of sense and defines what helps, I think, people understand true entrepreneurism, which is take intelligent risks.
Correct.
I love that.
Correct.
I love that phrase. And
And
having
I
that kind
think
of
what they also
clarity. Go
achieved,
ahead.
and I think what they also achieved is a wonderful balance of inward focused values and outward focused values. So the first value, members first, makes it extremely clear to everyone this is a company that is customer focused. Now, you find the customer first statement in many value statements of companies. I've seen them quite a few times. But members first has an innate power in it, and an innate drive. That's just these 2 words that just make it extremely clear what this is all about, right?
Yeah, and that's great. So let me ask you to dig in a little bit deeper on your soul system, because it's comprised, if I'm not mistaken, of 3 elements: shared purpose, shared understanding, shared behavior.
Correct.
Explain that, please.
Yeah. So purpose is or has been the buzzword for whatever last 10, 15 years. And I always had a challenging relationship with that term. And the reason why is because I've been in too many discussions where people talked about purpose as if it was the end, and to me, it's the beginning. It's the means to the end. It's not the end, and hence I defined at the core of the soul system shared purpose, and shared it at 2 levels. Because number one, the firm's purpose needs to be shared by the executive team wholeheartedly. Every leader, every member of the first line of leadership needs to really breathe this purpose, and very often they don't. Right. So if that's the prerequisite, I think, for it to work. But the second element often gets lost as well, which is that purpose needs to be shared with everyone inside the company, actually all the stakeholders, but obviously predominantly the employees. And how often have you been in companies where you come at reception and you look at the wall behind the receptionist and it looks great and there's great writing and great typography and wordsmithed sentences about what this company is all about. And then on your way from the entrance to whatever the conference room or wherever you were going, you encountered behaviors inside the company that didn't at all connect with what was written on the wall. So making sure that everyone inside the firm is aware of the purpose, but also knows what it means for him or her in their specific situation. I mean, there's this piece of research that I came about from EY. It's called the business case for purpose, and they interviewed 5,000 executives across the world. And 89% of those 5,000 basically said an organization with a shared purpose will have employee satisfaction, and purpose-driven firms deliver higher quality. That was 81%. So you think everybody's got it. It's fully understood and everybody understands the value. But then EY asked the same people the question about their own company, and only 50% said our organization's strategy is reflective of our sense of purpose, and only 38% said our staff have a clear understanding of the values and the purpose of the firm. So is a strange gap between what leaders think is important and why it is important versus the reality inside the companies.
Yeah, and that is just so true on so many levels. And regular listeners to this show will have heard me use this quote before. But the problem with communication is the illusion that it took place. So when we put up a sign, that's good, George Bernard Shaw, by the way. When we put up signs with great words and ideas, that's wonderful. But if people don't understand them, and more importantly, embrace them, it's really just kind of a waste of words. And oftentimes, in my experience, and I'd like your views on this, please. Management within companies put those things out and just assume that everyone, as you said, understands them and embraces them and shares them. What's your experience there, Ralph?
Well, one of my fellow co-founders at Spark 44, in our very early days, when we had a conversation about culture, said something that was extremely true and valuable, I think, for our discussion and then for the way we try to behave, which was culture. You see whether a company has culture when it comes to accepting costs that it takes. Sometimes things cost money, and when companies shy away from that expense when it matters, you see that it's only been just words. And so, I think that is really a critical thing. So once you commit to these things, to whatever your vision and your mission and your values are, and your spirit and the purpose, you got to live up to it. Because if you don't, I'd say you better didn't start at all, because the price that you pay is immense. I mean, look at what happened last year. End of last year, there was this massive layoff at Better.com with the 900 people fired on a Zoom call, which made the news headlines the world over. And I was asked to comment on that a few times, and I'm not an expert in Better.com. I didn't know the company before. But when I started to research a bit, it felt like everything the founder had tried to accomplish in the years from starting the company to that point was actually with a very true and best sense of meaning for everybody and for the company. So the goodwill was there all the time, and then this situation happened, and within an hour, all of that was washed away, and people inside the company didn't think that was the reality, that was the truth, but it was. And so not only the 900 people quit, they were forced to quit, but many more. And so everything that was built over years collapsed in just a short moment. And that's kind of what you got to be aware of when you do these things, because as we all know, corporate life isn't a straight line. It goes up and down. And when it goes down, you got to be prepared to live up to these values. And that's so critical.
Yeah, and that's a great example, and thanks for sharing that, Ralph. The 2 points come to mind. First of all, regardless of how one terms it, brand, reputation, culture, soul, spirit, is a long-term investment,
Yes.
and it can be shattered in an instant by one bad behavior, either on a macro stage like the one you just described, or sometimes on a micro stage where individual employees with customers can crush that. And the second thing is, you talked about the expense, and what I think is important is for people to, yes, does it cost money at times to continue that? Yes, and it also costs effort, so the expense of effort, but that expense is an investment. And when people, oftentimes the accountant and the money-driven mind walks away from that, it damages everything that's been built.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, when you're running a company, and it doesn't matter what size, what industry, and in which part of the world, as an executive, as a managing director, as a CEO or whatever, you are always facing constraints, right? I mean, there's not enough time, there's not enough budget, there's not enough resource here, there's not enough this, and there's not enough that. And one of the things I found through my corporate career is one of the most powerful things a strong culture brings you as a leader is it increases your resources big time, because the commitment that you gain from your people, if they buy into it, is priceless. I mean, you can't even put a number next to it, because if you have these people working with you on a certain project, on a certain task, and they really give their everything to make it happen, and share the pride when it happens, that is something that you just don't get with a 9 to 5 approach. And kind of, yeah, we have a culture here of collaboration. Yeah, well, a culture of collaboration in times when it matters. You see the difference in companies with soul, right? I mean, there's this other piece of research that I've quoted in the book from O.C. Tanner. Wonderful research, because it's global and you can see differences per countries. But overall, in general, what O.C. Tanner's Global Culture Report suggests is that, and they call companies that I call companies with soul, they call thriving cultures. And they say in thriving cultures are 13 times more likely to have highly engaged employees, have an 8 times higher incidence of great work, and a double likelihood of increased revenues. And so that's all on the plus side, but there's also 2 elements that thriving culture are characterized by, according to O.C. Tanner, which is employees in these cultures are 3 times less likely to face burnout situations, and the companies are 3 times less likely to have layoffs. So culture, even if it costs money at times, is actually, as you said, an investment in the growth of the company. And that's why on the subtitle of the book, the way I framed it was to say building corporate soul is about powering culture and success with the soul system. Because some people say, well, culture is a bit of airy-fairy. It's not airy-fairy. It's a critical resource for any company to actually drive success and growth, and have a highly motivated workforce, and happy people drive better products, drive happier clients. So there's a lot for it to be done beyond just food for free or whatever, table tennis, all of these things. That's not about culture. I mean, that's nice to have, nothing wrong with it. But if you think that is, once you buy these things, you're done, well, good luck.
I was speaking about that with a client just yesterday. So that example is spot on. Um, so you talked, well, let me just, the companies that recognize, and the leaders in those companies that recognize the benefit of building their soul, and their culture, and have a thriving culture, are the ones that realize the benefits, and the ones that scoff at it don't realize what they're missing. And another observation, I think, is that what you're talking about is a long-term strategy. You're in it for the long gain, the long term, right?
Yes, definitely. But that doesn't mean that you only look at it with what's going to happen in the next 10 years. People react to what you do as a leader pretty much immediately, right? I mean, the good friend of mine said to me one day when I was getting into my first leadership role, said, "Kid, you got to be clear. You're not dinner table conversation." And that's the reality. People talk about what you as a leader are doing, and while 20 years or 30 years ago this was a dinner table conversation, now you have the risk it becomes a social media conversation, which if you do the wrong thing, you just don't want to have, right? So to me, yes, it's a long-term game, but it doesn't mean that if you start tomorrow, you only see it bearing fruit in 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
Right.
I think when you do that, you actually will see results pretty quickly. And I've got one example in the book. I had the pleasure to interview Adrian Hallmark, who's the CEO and chairman of Bentley Motors. And he took over the company, I think, exactly at this day 4 years ago. And when he took the leadership of the company didn't make any profits. There were talks and there was press about it, news that Volkswagen Group would probably sell Bentley Motors. And just like I think a month ago or so, he announced their future plan, which was applauded the world over and within Volkswagen Group big time. And at the same time, he was faced with not only a loss-making company that he had to start with, but you had COVID, like all of us had, but he also, on top of it, had Brexit that was not making actually life easier. And I think Adrian took an approach very early on when he had full understanding, full sight of what was supposed to happen. He basically gave a leap of faith to all his people. So he organized a big town hall with 4,500 people and explained to everyone what the situation of the company was. And also explained that it wasn't anybody's fault who was here, but it would be everybody's responsibility to help get to a better place. And he continued those town halls very regularly. And one thing that he hoped wouldn't happen, and actually didn't happen, was nobody leaked anything to the press. Which usually in these situations, when you have to talk about company strategies with 4,500 people, it's going to leak somewhere. But it didn't leak. And I think the reason why it didn't leak, and when I visited him last year, I talked to some of the people inside the factory, and their response was, no. We saw the commitment to our future. We saw it was genuine, it came from the heart, and it was with a lot of passion. And why would we put out any kind of news to anyone when it actually shoots against ourselves? So he gained the commitment of his people by being very open and transparent, and they've done a remarkable job. They had 2 record years in the meantime, and they've got a strategy that is really super powerful moving forward. So that's why I'm saying it is a long-term thing, but it reveals its power very early on. You can see it, and you can, as a leader, you are actually you have a great potential to take people with you. And I mean, when we started Spark 44, I came across a great South African proverb which I put on the wall because I thought it was just saying exactly what needed to be said. And that proverb goes like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And really, long term is far, but it doesn't mean it can't be fast.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%, and I appreciate very much the clarification. And I didn't intend to imply that it was only going to yield long-term gains. What I meant to imply is that a company without the soul, without the culture that you're talking about, can have short-term results by swinging the hammer and by just you know acting however they choose to act, regardless of soul and culture and members first type of mentality. But in the long run, that's going to wear thin. And I think having your example earlier of Meta letting all of those people go, so they've had great success, but in the long term, that's going to hold them back or deter them a little bit, I believe. So there's so much in this book, but before I get more into the book, Ralf, what I'd love to get from you is some insight on how you've got to where you are now. Just share a bit about your journey into life in general, but professional life, and ultimately getting into McCann Erickson and Spark 44, and then to author of soon-to-be best-selling book.
Yes, so it's actually an interesting journey because it obviously wasn't linear, like most journeys aren't linear, which I think when you start getting into your professional life, you think, okay, I'll do the one, and then I'll do two, and then I'll do three, and it's all going to be happening straight, but it doesn't. So my initial intention was to become a journalist, and I had the great honor and actually luxury, I would call it, that very early on I had the opportunity to spend a few months at Stern magazine, which is like the equivalent of Newsweek, probably, in the US.
And where were you then, if I may ask?
That was in Germany and at Bertelsmann Group, actually, and I came in there. I got in there with high hopes. It was like, I was in my early 20s, so I thought this is about the honesty and all of these things. And what I saw and what I witnessed was actually, it wasn't like that. It wasn't actually not what I thought it was. And so my disappointment grew quickly. But at the same time, in the same company, I then had the opportunity to spend time in the marketing department, and I came across two advertising geniuses at the time, and kind of that sparked the interest. And a bit later, I got the opportunity to join McCann Erickson, and their mission statement was the one that actually still resonates very strongly with me, and I was very happy to see their employer branding campaign happening right now around that theme, and the theme is Truth Well Told. It was developed by Harrison McCann back in the 1920s, I think, if I recall correctly. So I moved from journalism to advertising, and climbed up the ranks and worked in various account positions, moved up to managing director positions on global accounts. Did that, and at one moment in, I think, around 2002 or 3, I met a guy called Steve Wolford, who was running the digital marketing division of McCann World Group at the time. And we were dealing with a client situation that we only could solve together. And so we worked together pretty much night and day for 4 or 5 months. And Steve was LA based, so he flew over quite a lot to Europe. And we always stayed in contact. And at the end of 2010, when I didn't expect it at all, I was sitting at my home that evening on the sofa and having a glass of wine, and all of a sudden the phone rings and Steve's on the line and says, "Listen, I've got this opportunity here to build a joint venture with Jaguar Land Rover to basically set up their marketing communications globally. And are you interested to do that with me?" I thought he was joking first because I couldn't believe it. But then he sent me the business plan, and I called him back the next day and said, "Okay, Steve, here we go. Let's do this." And and then we basically built that company from scratch, which is to a degree a luxury, but obviously it's also a constraint. But the luxury element is that you can design it the way you want, and I think that was really a luxury moment for all of us. And I remember the five of us, the five founders at the time, were sitting in a room in London in an agency that a friend had offered us the room for a day, because obviously we didn't have any offices or anything else that would look like an agency. And we had like 5 or 6 flip charts in the room, and said, "Well, okay, now how do we build the agency? How do we design it? How do we want the organization to happen? What culture do we want to see?" And it's one of these moments when, in anticipation, you've got lots of things in your mind, but then when it comes to putting it on a flip chart, you actually stop and go like, so how do we really do this? And as there was a bit of silence in the room, we then flipped the question and said, "So, in terms of the culture, what culture do we not want to see?" And then we started sort of with the opt-out, and that was pretty straightforward. And the lists on the flip charts were pretty full quickly. And from that, we basically designed the organization in order to avoid situations that we all experienced in previous working relationships, as best as we could, to make sure that we got off to a flying start. And then we had to hire, I think, 80 people in 4 offices. It was LA, London, Frankfurt, and Shanghai within 3.5 months, and set up office space and all the rest of it, and get going. And well, you get into a flow. You have to do it, and actually it was great fun. And hiring people for a company that doesn't exist is an interesting experience that I would never miss.
Yeah, well, that. Like you said, that's quite a journey. Let me just highlight one thing you said, because it's so true so often, and that is that, be it a business or be it individual, oftentimes to find out what we want, flipping it and starting with what we don't want. I think most of us have a pretty clear understanding of what we don't want, and to take a lot of things off the table, if you will, I think is a wonderful exercise. Be it building a company or be it looking at our own personal journey and our own personal purpose. And that gets me to the point that to tie back to where you had started with, where purpose has been a buzzword for some time. This podcast is all about helping people and or companies to discover and clarify and live their purpose. And what I always say is that purpose, as you mentioned, is the starting point. And what I talk about in my purpose principle is that finding your purpose sparks your passion, which is the fuel.
Yes.
And then persistence keeps it going. So that's kind of a starting point. But you talk about purpose. You call it it's the flavor of the day in discussions about corporate leadership, but that your book aims to build a framework on how to accomplish, achieve, identify everything that this podcast talks about. So with that, um, I'm just going to kind of open the floor to you and to talk a little bit about some of what's in the book, because it, I encourage everyone listening to get this book. Again, whether you are a leader of a large company, a small company, or just on your own, there's so much value in this book. And just some of the chapter titles: the Soul System, Purpose Meets Soul, Understand the Soul of Your Company, Lead with Soul, Promote Soul Drivers, Hire Soul Makers, Grow Soul Leaders. There's so much here, and having a framework is terrific. So, like I said, I'm gonna hush and ask you to kind of give more insight into the framework and how you've built it.
Yeah, so we already talked about the shared purpose and the shared understanding, which is I'd say the strategic underpinning of everything. But then, as I call the third layer, the shared behaviors. It's about what you do and how you do it. And it is by no means you have to do it exactly like this, because what the book offers are great examples from great companies. So the book celebrates companies that are doing it right. It doesn't talk about anything that anybody does wrong, because I don't think that there isn't that's not where the value is. The value is in learning from companies that do it right. And I'm not quoting one company or looking at one company that does everything right, because I don't think that exists, because, as you said, it's a long-term thing. I think there's lots of companies who are doing things right in many facets of what I call the soul system. And you already mentioned some of the topics. So it is about compensation. Yes, of course. It's part of it. You can't say that the ping pong table tennis thing covers the 8% gap that you don't want to pay to get to an adequate salary. No. So compensation is an element, and how do you deal with that? Recruiting, a very critical element. Development. So people inside the organization, how can they develop to progress their career in any shape or form? But also moving away from the pure employee relationship, employee-employer relationship, which partnerships should a company get itself into? And how does the shared purpose and the shared understanding suggest what to do and what not to do? How to deal with your clients, your customers, followers, as I call them, because I think if you look at brands like Porsche is a good example, or Apple is another great example. Their clients are actually followers. There's a connection between the brand and and its customers that goes beyond a transactional. I buy this because it gives me this or that or the other. Leadership principles and looking at the entire ecosystem of the organization. So, give you one example. When the book was written and I started to post on social media about it, somebody dropped me an email and said, "I like it so much. I think this is so important. This is so great. But look, I am not happy where I'm working right now, and I would like to move to a company with soul. Can you help me? Can you tell me, how do I find a company with soul?" And I thought it was a very legitimate question, because as we're now seeing this, some call it the Great Resignation. I like what such as Ryan Rosvansky from Microsoft and LinkedIn call it the Great Reshuffle, because I think that does more justice to what's really happening, because
Yes.
people are reevaluating their current jobs, and when they think, well, doesn't really make the cut, they are searching for something else. And how do they find that something else? And the obviously the book contains a lot of research, and most of the research is publicly available. So you can look at Glassdoor, and you can when you search for a company, you can look at their culture scores on Glassdoor, and you can compare companies in the same sector, and you'll be amazed what you see, because often and that's where the advertising agencies seem to do a good job. Your initial sense of reputation of the company might be very high, but when you then look into these comparable employees evaluations, you get to know a bit more about the company that you just want to consider. And it doesn't mean that it's always applicable to the office where you land finally, the team that you work with, but it gives you a sense of the context, and it allows anybody who's looking for a job to actually ask the right questions when they're being interviewed. And my recommendation to everyone is, as much as companies ask you to offer or to provide references of your previous working relationships, ask the companies to provide references of happy employees. And if I was a leader in a company right here, right now, I'd really carefully look at these Glassdoor evaluations. And yes, sometimes you got to treat them with a grain of salt, because people who just left and didn't leave on good terms post their comments. That's true, but it's true for every company inside that universe. So it actually equalizes. So be humble as a leader and learn from that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, as a leader, very often people say when you're the captain of the ship, you're the most lonely person on the ship. That might be the case, but actually, you have a choice, because I'd never felt the most lonely person on the ship. And the reason I didn't feel like the most lonely person on the ship was that I had a team with me of people who shared the purpose, who were fully engaged in making things happen. And they came up with strong ideas, with great ideas. I mean, there's one that I always like to quote, which is we were a global organization, and one of the key elements was collaboration between offices. And we had two guys, Gonzalo in Madrid and Leticia in Sao Paulo. And because of the language, Spanish and Portuguese, they thought, well, we could do things together, could do projects together, and get to greater output. And so they did that, and it was wonderful. And one day they came and said, we have an idea. We would like to have an exchange program. So have one person from Sao Paulo move to Madrid for a month, and somebody from Madrid move south. We would sort it all out. No big deal. Not high. Not a lot of cost, because it's just the air ticket, more or less, and we cover everything else. And I said, yeah, of course, let's do that. So they did it. It happened. They talked about it. They made sure everybody in the company knew about it. And very quickly, with a bit of endorsement and support from senior management, we made that a global program, and we called it Spark B&B. And it was, all of a sudden, it was coded. It was something that people said, oh, we also want to do that Spark B&B program for our office. So how can we partner with other offices? And beyond the pure effect of those two individuals swapping jobs for a month and learning a bit more about a different culture, what actually happened was, inside the entire company, across all 18 offices, that became a bit of additional glue that brought everybody together and ensured that the company acted as one. And so it wasn't anything that leadership proposed or suggested, let's do that. It was basically coming bottom up. And as a leader, I think you have that much power and that much resource with your fellow leaders that you really need to leverage, and that's great if you do.
Yeah, and that's a fabulous story, and on many levels, not the least of which is having employees with the initiative to say we can work well together in the first place. Because let's face it, Spanish and Portuguese are not as similar as we might think off the surface. There's a bit of a challenge there. But for them to say, hey, let's work together, and then to say we can even improve if we can better integrate into the other system, that's important. But what's fabulous in your story is the leadership being open to listening and open to looking at the potential and saying, yes, that meets what our culture, what our soul, what our spirit is all about, and embracing that. So I think you really hit on something very important, and the terminology, the Great Reshuffle, I do think does a lot more justice than the Great Resignation. But your work and your experience in coming out in a book probably is at an ideal time, because I think people are literally more aware than ever that life is short, things happen that we have no control over. Why am I miserable where I am?
Absolutely.
And that's part of what drives me to do this, because I was in that situation for a long time, and it took me a long time to become aware of that, and to start to seek a different culture. So yeah, I think your book is couldn't be better timing,
Thank you.
and that's why I want to help get the word out, because it's not only going to help leaders, it's going to help everyone within any company from top to bottom to be involved in a place with a much better culture, better communicated, better understood. Um, so you have, and in deference to time, I want to be very respectful of your time. You have developed a soul index.
Yes.
Can you talk briefly about that, please?
Yes. So, as I was finishing the writing of the book, and after having worked for months on interviews and research and surveys, I thought, actually, you know what, there must be something in this, because whenever I looked at these surveys and looked at the companies that were at the top of these rankings, I was like, well, these are companies that are really successful companies. So I thought, why not take a look at these various rankings and blend them into an index that has a strong bias on employee data, right? So the Soul Index is a performance ranking that has a strong weight in employee data, whether it's employee satisfaction, employee engagement, or CEO approval of the employees. That makes 75% of the index. The other 25% are business data, like Interbrands Best Global Brands data, for instance, are part of this. And the ranking, the top 20 ranking, um, with Adobe at the top and Salesforce and Microsoft following Swift, is a ranking that provides um, a very powerful um, evidence of uh, the fact that culture and success are two sides of the same coin. So when the ranking was finished and I saw the names of those 20 companies in the top 20, I thought this would be quite good in terms of returns. And then I asked my bank whether they could do me a favor and then help me with calculating the performance of that portfolio if you would have invested in it, and happily they did. And so um, over 5 years, it outperformed Nasdaq, which already was strong with 180%. At 199, and I think Dow Jones and S&P were like 75 and 83 or so. So, and to me, it's not about 1% more or less, but um, in, in the grand scheme of things, it shows that these companies are very, very strong. And the good news is it's a pretty balanced index setup. So tech is a bit stronger, which I think is no surprise given the importance of human capital in tech industries, and the fact that they basically started business in the 70s and a bit later. So um, it's a unique performance ranking. And there are others out there, which obviously the Just Capital just announced their Just Capital 100 in the US a few months ago, and it's got similar results. And it shows that if employees who are closest to what's happening inside the company um, rate their firm, they have a pretty good sense of whether this is up for success or not, because these employee data are driving that index, and the index results are showing that success is happening in those firms big time.
Yeah, and I love that it's starting with purpose, building a framework, and then having the index that starts to validate everything that you've talked about. So as we wind up here, I am going to end with my typical question that I end every show with, and from your journey from journalist to advertising to creator of a framework and for developing corporate soul. When you put all that together, Ralf, share with us from your perspective, what's the point?
Well, I think the point is that over the course of your career or my career, you learn increasingly, ideally, the value of human interactions and the value of what I call a human-centric performance culture. You can drive performance with many, many things, but the one most important thing, I think, is if you focus on your people and help them become greater leaders. And when we started the show, you mentioned that the book was inspired by the many messages I received, and there's a number of those messages that basically said something like, "I've accomplished things that I never even thought I was capable of. Thank you." And when you get those messages, you know what you've done it for. And I think that's the point, is helping others along the way. And I mean, I wasn't born that way, so you basically develop yourself, and you learn from others, and you take the best that you see and try to bring it to what you're doing. And nobody's perfect all the time. I've made mistakes. No, everybody makes mistakes. But when you get such a feedback at the end of that part of your career, you can be very proud, and that's what I was.
Yeah, well, I think that's terrific. I couldn't agree with you more that helping others to develop themselves more is a very noble cause and a very self-fulfilling cause. Ralf Specht, the author of the newly released book, Building Corporate Soul, Powering Culture and Success with the Soul System. Thank you so much for your time. A link to the book, a link to your Jaguar work, which is fabulous, and your social media and contact information will be in the show notes. I wish you tremendous success with the book. I think it has a very timely and very important role in the furthering of business as a whole. So thank you for your time, Ralf. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Bill. It was my pleasure to be on the show.
Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. We can promise you'll gain value in every one. Rating and reviewing makes us more discoverable and helps others find out what's the point. And if you'd like to know more about Bill Ellis or contact him, please visit his website, www.brandingpillars.com. See you next time.